Hello and welcome to AFAL Podcasts, the home of objective, up-to-date and independent reporting on Turkey. Don't forget to follow our reports through social media, on afalnews.com or through our mobile app. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to the Ahval podcast series program. Today we have scholar Amy Austin Holmes as a guest. Amy Austin Holmes is an associate professor of sociology at the American University who's on leave this year and currently visiting scholar at Harvard on Middle East Initiative program. Welcome to the program, Amy.
Hi, thanks.
The reason I wanted to invite you and you kindly accepted to talk about, first of all, Turkey's main opposition party, CHP, held an international conference on Syria, and you were one of the speakers. First, I would like to hear about your impression of the conference, just to give a very small background to our listeners. Turkey's main opposition secular party, CHP, held this conference for the first time. CHP has many different opinions and opposition to current AKP government Syria policy. From the beginning, Turkey is home to 3.6 million or more Syrian refugees, so it's a big and very important issue for Turkey. And lastly, surveys show now Turkish public see Syrian refugee issue is one of the top 3 issues in their daily lives. Yes, Amy, we are listening to you now.
Okay. Well, thank you again for inviting me. That's right. So I attended the conference in Istanbul last weekend. It took place last Saturday. I was invited by the CHP party to speak about U.S. policy towards Syria. And I accepted the invitation because I actually wanted to take part in a constructive dialogue about Syria that could, contribute to improving the relations between the United States and Turkey, and to understand the CHP's approach to Syria. And I had actually hoped that this conference would help find a way forward to avoid further conflict, particularly regarding the so-called security mechanism or safe zone that the U.S. has been negotiating between Ankara and the SDF for several months now, and Erdogan's plan to deport Syrian refugees there. So, I thought this would be an opportunity to engage with, an audience in Turkey and to hear their perspectives. And because I think we're at a crucial turning point now. And I presented, I was in the first panel with colleagues from, there was a person representing the European Union who spoke about the EU position towards Syria, another person speaking about the Russian perspective, another person speaking about the Iranian perspective towards Syria or policy, the Iraqi policy towards Syria, and then I was asked to speak about the U.S. policy towards Syria. And actually, this was supposed to be a Chatham House. We were told it was going to be under Chatham House rules. The first 2 opening remarks had been made by İmamoğlu and then the CHP chairman Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. Those were public remarks, but then after that, we were told it was actually going to be Chatham House rules. And that's why I was personally quite, surprised to then see the media reaction to my comments. And this, it's been going on now for a week, basically. So, virtually every day there's been.
Yes. So I tried to do some search today, and you have been attacked pretty much all Erdogan's media, but also, places like Cumhuriyet, which is now ultra-nationalist newspaper. For those who didn't follow this situation closely, after you spoke about the Syrian Kurds as well. It's a very hot topic in Turkey, and Turkey sees it as a terrorist organization, as an extension of PKK, a group that has been fighting against the Turkish army for about 4 decades. So you talk about Syrian situation, Syrian Kurdish situation. Turkish President Erdogan also said in a day or two, basically, Turkey might be intervening. And your remarks came a week before, and the pro-AKP papers now accusing you, quote-unquote, terrorist supporter, and usually they use yandash terrorist, which is even derogatory term. So how do you see this situation, where maybe you can address this issue as how the outside of Turkey sees Syrian Kurds, and how Turkish public or Turkish pro-AKP, pro-government public sees the Syrian Kurdish situation?
Right. Well, I mean, so, first of all, I just want to point out that I've actually been visiting Turkey regularly since 2003. And I've never experienced anything like this before, this kind of a reaction. I first visited Turkey in 2003 when I began my work for my PhD, which was focused on the history of the US military presence in Turkey and Germany, and actually the history of opposition movements against US military bases in Turkey and Germany. And so I have not, shied away from controversial topics in the past. I've covered the full range of opposition movements during the Cold War and after the Cold War in Turkey, ranging from protests against the Sixth Fleet to the İşçi Partisi under Mehmet Ali Aybar, to the armed militant attacks by the THKPO and the THKPJ against the U.S. military bases, and a whole range of labor strikes on the U.S. military bases. So I've looked at sensitive issues before, and I've dealt with sensitive or controversial topics, published about this, published a book, directed a documentary film, and I've just never, been attacked like this before. So it's quite, I think it's quite revealing that this is, where we have arrived now in Turkey, that this is the way my presentation was received. Because, I actually began my presentation by going over the recommendations from the Syria Study Group, which is a congressionally mandated bipartisan group that published a report just 2 days before the conference on the USIP website, so anybody can read it. And because I was asked to speak about US policy towards Syria, and I only had like 10 minutes, I thought just reading their 7 recommendations in their report would be sort of the quickest way to quickly summarize what the US policy is at the current moment towards Syria. And then I went over some of my own research that I've done on the Syrian Democratic Forces in Syria, mainly pointing out the fact that now the rank and file fighters in the Syrian Democratic Forces are actually majority Arab. It's often referred to as a Kurdish force, even, in the American media and also in Turkey, but that's actually inaccurate. I mean, the majority of the rank and file members are Arabs. And that's because as the SDF, captured more territory from the Islamic State and liberated cities like Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, those are major Arab population centers. Arabs were recruited into the SDF. And so now, this is, so I basically just, pointed out a very basic demographic fact, which is that Northeast Syria is a diverse region. The population is ethnically diverse. And the SDF reflects that. The Syrian Democratic Forces reflect that ethnic diversity. So you have Arabs, Kurds, Syriac, Assyrian, Chaldean Christians, Yazidis, and Turkmen. There's a Turkmen minority in Syria that has also joined the SDF. And I have surveyed all of these ethnic groups. I mean, they're all part of my survey in my data set. And so it's a multi-ethnic force, a multi-religious force. And I just I think it's important for people to realize this because, it's just portrayed, the SDF is portrayed as, a Kurdish force, as identical to the PKK. And, it's actually a diverse, multi-ethnic, fighting force that is focused on defeating the Islamic State inside Syria. And this was, portrayed as something scandalous. I mean, normally, if you're, sort of providing demographic information to an audience, that's not the reaction that you would normally expect, right? I mean, 20% of the population is this, 45% is this. I mean, that's, you would normally expect people to maybe, unless you're talking to a group of demographers, I mean, it's not exactly something that would be that people would consider to be scandalous in any case. So, but I guess providing even just basic demographic information is now considered, scandalous by the vast majority of the Turkish media anyway, based on their reactions to what I said.
Let me follow up with this. So Turkish official position is that YPG is linked to PKK, and actually on October 5th, Saturday speech, President Erdogan this time talked about Syrian democratic forces, like he was talking about YPG, and he said that SDF just a guise to hide other terrorists, something similar to this effect. But originally, until very recently, Turkey more of attacking YPG and seeing that as a reflection of PKK, and was away from the SDF. When you discuss about the YPG, how would you characterize them? Do you think there is enough link for Erdogan or Turkey to be angry and go after this group?
So, I mean, the SDF, as you know, grew out of the YPG and the YPJ, which were predominantly a Kurdish group. But my point is that this has since, for years now, has evolved into a very different kind of force. As I said, it's a multi-ethnic force, multi-religious, and they are focused on the situation inside Syria. I mean, they are focused on still going after the remaining sleeper cells, the, attacks that have happened even after the caliphate was declared to be defeated in March. And this is their mission, this is their mandate, and this is what the United States has been, why we partnered with them. So the, and they are focused on also rebuilding this 1/3 of Syria, which desperately needs to be rebuilt. Because this is, another point that I made in my talk, that the stabilization efforts have actually slowed down and stalled. So it wasn't just Trump's withdrawal announcement that, in my opinion, was problematic, but also his zeroing out the stabilization funding. Because if we don't, rebuild a basic level of, the cities in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, we should expect that other Islamist groups will come along and exploit those grievances. And, and this is something that we should all be interested in preventing, right? And it's not just the United States, but it's a 79-country coalition, the global coalition to defeat the Islamic State that's been partnering with the SDF. And so, if Turkey thinks that anyone or the Turkish media thinks that anybody who, talks to the SDF or recognizes what they've done and their accomplishments in Northeast Syria, that they're somehow a PKK supporter, then, I mean, logically, they should accuse all 79 countries that are part of the global coalition of being PKK supporters, because there are 79 countries in this coalition that have, partnered with the SDF and that are working, on achieving an enduring defeat of the Islamic State. And so this is, why, but at the same time, the US has taken Turkey's concerns very seriously. And this is why we've been working on the border security issue, the safe zone, the security mechanism for so long, And there are they've been putting out tweets and photos and videos just in the past, just today even, showing how they've agreed to do these joint land patrols, the joint air patrols, that some fortifications were removed along the border. And so this is, all to show that we do take Turkey's concerns very seriously. But I think that, I think that a Turkish incursion into northeast Syria would only trigger further instability. It would only lead to more refugees. I mean, Turkey says they want to, return the refugees, right? But I mean, an intervention would actually only lead to greater refugee outflows.
Let me ask that.
So it would actually achieve the opposite of what it wants.
This is a great point you are making, and I just wanted to ask a question on that. This is obviously following Turkish media very closely, and not only pro-government, almost 90% of the Turkish media and the TV channels are under the government control, but also there are some ultranationalist channels also describe the situation about same. The situation is this, according to Turkish public, or how the situation is reflected to Turkish public, is that there is a quote-unquote terror corridor is being created in the south border of Turkey. These are terrorists, these are PKK, and this group are getting the support of the US. And if not today, tomorrow, there will be a big threat for the Turkish national security. That's why we have to intervene. This is a kind of a narrative is being played and shown every single day and several times per day. It is not the right picture. What is the correct picture?
The correct picture is that, Syrians have been suffering now for years from the conflict in Syria, and that they desperately, for the first time in more than 7 years, one third of Syria is relatively stable because the Islamic State is defeated and because the regime, for the most part, is not present in this 1/3 of Syria. And I think it would be a huge step back if Turkey were to, jeopardize all of that, were to jeopardize the fragile stability that has been achieved in the Northeast. The SDF defeated the Islamic State, which was on Turkey's border, on, the border, in Kobane, for example, directly on the border to Turkey. I mean, Turkey should actually be happy that the Syrian Democratic Forces defeated a terrorist organization that was directly on their border. And so if the other consideration regarding the refugees, it's not just, Turkey, we have to acknowledge that Turkey has, of course, played an important role in hosting over 3 million refugees. But again, as I said, this another conflict, whether it takes, whatever form it takes, another intervention would probably trigger more refugee flows, which is something that also Iraqi Kurdistan, the Kurdistan region of Iraq, is also, wants to avoid at all costs, because they themselves, Iraq is also dealing with a huge IDP population still. People have not been able to return home in Iraq. People are still living in tents, and they also really just, are not interested in having to deal with another outflow of Syrians that, because the border to Turkey is closed, if they can't get into Turkey, they would, presumably go to Iraq. And so really neither Turkey nor Iraq has an interest in receiving more Syrian refugees. That's been very clear. And so that's why actually all parties should also try to avoid any kind of intervention or conflict that would lead to, people being killed or people having to flee their homes again in Syria.
President Erdogan is talking about this, constructing these new houses with gardens or backyards for about 1 to 2 million Syrian refugees. do you think this plan is doable, and how do you see so far U.S. reaction to these plans?
So, one of the other points that I made at the conference is that any return of Syrian refugees to Syria has to be voluntary. It has to be dignified, and it has to be, to their region of origin. Forcibly deporting Syrian refugees from Turkey back to Syria is illegal. It's against international, human rights law, and that's a point that the U.S. has been trying to stress. Now, as you may know, the regime of the Ba'athist regime in Damascus in the 1960s had a Arabization policy whereby they forcibly displaced Arabs into the Kurdish region of Syria in the north in order to fragment and break up that region and sort of dilute the Kurdish, this Kurdish region in the north of Syria. And, when Erdogan, says that he's going to first, intervene in Syria, create this, safe zone, and then deport millions of Syrians into that safe zone. I mean, most of the, people who are, for example, from Raqqa, if they want to go back to Syria, they probably want to go back to Raqqa because that's where their home is. All right. I mean, and if they're from Deir ez-Zor, they probably want to go back to Deir ez-Zor. They don't want to go to Qamishli or Kobani or somewhere in the north. So, this idea, what Erdogan has been saying, I mean, it reminds me of the Ba'athist, Arabization policy of, forcibly displacing Arabs into the Kurdish region of the north in order to, fragment and destroy essentially this region that exists now in the north by undermining the stability that they've fought so hard to achieve. So, this is something that is highly, highly problematic. I mean, his claim or his plan to deport Syrian refugees. And I think that I hope that the European Union and the United States can work together to convince Turkey that this is absolutely, an unacceptable project that he's speaking about and that he spoke about also at the United Nations recently.
Scholar Amy Austin Holmes, also the writer of the Turkish-U.S. military relations. The name of the book, Social Unrest and American Military Bases in Turkey and Germany since 1945. It focuses on 7 decades of the relationship, and also author of Coups and Revolutions, Mass Mobilization, the Egyptian Military and the United States from Mubarak to Sisi, a book on Egypt. And now I believe, if I am not mistaken, due to this book you wrote about Sisi's current Egypt and its recent law on NGOs, you may not be welcome to Egypt?
Well, I actually have also been attacked in the Egyptian state-controlled media. So last spring, actually one day before Sisi was announced the winner of the elections in Egypt, there was also a concerted and coordinated media campaign in the state-controlled media in Egypt against me, claiming that I was part of a foreign conspiracy, claiming that I'm trying to undermine Egypt's security because of my contacts with the Nubian minority in Egypt, which is a non-Arab minority who has been, forcibly Arabized in Egypt because the Nubian language has been suppressed. So the Nubian language is not actually taught anywhere in Egypt. And so I actually had seen a number of similarities between the Nubians in Egypt and the Kurds in Syria, in the sense that they've both been, non-Arab minorities that have been forcibly Arabized by their central governments. And in any case, I had visited a Nubian resettlement village, and where the Nubians were forcibly displaced to after the building of dams along the Nile, and the Egyptian mukhabarat, tried to create some scandal around the fact that I visited a Nubian resettlement village, although, there's no law that says you cannot visit a Nubian village. I mean, so I didn't break any law. I didn't do anything wrong. I just went to this village, and, they tried to present that as some kind of scandal. And in any case, I mean, that's a long story, but and now my book about the coup in 2013 and the removal of Morsi, which I call a military coup, and the counter-revolution that has happened since then, is another reason why I'm currently not in Egypt, but here in the United States.
I hear you. So at the same time, you attracted both pro-Sisi and pro-Erdogan media attacks. There's kind of a interesting angle too. Let me finish by asking, going forward, President Erdogan says that Turkey might be intervening. Expectation is, if that were to happen, such intervention would probably be limited and for Erdogan to testing the waters, but we'll see how it's going to turn out. How do you think such an intervention would go down in Washington, whether we would see any kind of reaction, or the Congress is too busy with impeachment process to look and see such developments outside?
Well, you're right that the United States is currently quite focused on the impeachment discussions and the presidential elections here in the United States, or the campaign for the next presidential election. So this is true, but there are also, there's not just actually U.S. military personnel on the ground in northern Syria, but also State Department officials, because we have restarted our stabilization program. After the withdrawal announcement that was made last December, some of those State Department personnel left northeast Syria, but they've now returned and they're actually continuing their work, to rebuild, to help in the reconstruction and stabilization efforts of northeast Syria, which, as I said, is desperately necessary. So, I think that it's very hard to know how serious these threats are that Erdogan has been making. I think, by one tally, Erdogan has threatened to intervene northeast Syria at more than 23 times since in the last year or so. So, it's hard to know if he actually is serious this time, or if he's just using this as a bluff. Absolutely. To pressure, the United States to get even more concessions. I have heard quite a bit of frustration from some of these people who work on stabilization issues in Syria, because they have to actually spend, one person told me they spend like 90% of their time focusing on dealing with Turkish demands and the so-called safe zone and security mechanism, when there are many other urgent things that have to be done in northeast Syria. I mean, they need to, remove the rubble, turn the lights back on, allow people to have electricity, get the schools open, rebuild the hospitals. I mean, these are truly urgent, humanitarian issues that have to be addressed. And, if U.S. officials have to spend so much time negotiating with Ankara, it just takes a huge amount of time and energy away from other things that are also very, very important that need to be dealt with. And I mentioned this also in my talk in Istanbul at the CHP conference, and also that the international community needs to accept responsibility for their ISIS detainees. I mean, the SDF has been housing and, feeding and housing thousands of ISIS detainees. There are about 2,000 that are not Syrian and not Iraqi, and they're being held there in the Al-Hol camp. And those fighters need to be taken back and brought to justice in their home countries. There's no reason why the SDF should, have to bear that burden. So, these are all points that I made in my talk. Unfortunately, the content of my of my talk in the, at the conference, most of it has not actually been addressed in these media articles about me, but instead just baseless accusations are repeated in the media. And I've actually asked the CHP to release the video of my talk, because I have nothing to hide. I, stand by what I said. I think it would be important actually for the public in Turkey to understand, for example, what are those recommendations in the Syria study group, which I discussed in my presentation. And but it's really, it shows how the Turkish media landscape has just been transformed into this, unfortunately, pro-regime, machine that just repeats, baseless accusations. I mean, there's even a photo circulating that, claims to be me, and it's not me. But it's like, a woman wearing a headscarf. That was taken from an article I published in 2015. Right? So that's a photo in an article that I published, but it's not me. But I mean, the media is just circulating this image. I mean, they don't even do basic fact check, basic things. I mean, it's abysmal. It's just ridiculous. I think this morning I went through and I found around 45 different articles about me in a whole bunch of different, media outlets. And only 2 of them actually more or less accurately described what I said. So 2 articles out of 45, summarized with some consistency about, in some accuracy what I had said at my presentation. And the other 43 articles were just, baseless propaganda. So this is obviously, I think it just says a lot about the current state of the Turkish media landscape, unfortunately.
Yes, I am here and listening to you, and I am very sorry that you went through such experience, and I wish I would strongly disagree with you and argue with you on behalf of Turkish media, but unfortunately in Turkish media, under the regime control, is basically attacking the critical journalists and attacking the activists and attacking the human rights defenders and attacking the experts like yourself who come to Turkey and talk about the situation, the problems in the region, which most of them very closely relate to Turkey. But kind of a response you receive from Turkish media, I am sorry for that, and we are hoping that Turkish media will come around once again and we'll have little, we'll do at least little better than the full propaganda machine repeating each other by basis of accusations. And you are also about to publish a new report on Syrian Kurdish forces, Syrian Democratic Forces. Can you tell us a little bit on that?
Sure. So I began this research in 2015 in Kobane in northeast Syria. I've continued it since then and made multiple trips back to the northeast. So far this year, I've spent over 2 months in northeast Syria. I've traveled to all of the 6 different provinces of the northeast. And I've conducted the survey in many different cities and villages all around this northeast part of Syria, in order to understand what the Syrian Democratic Forces want in the future, what are their plans for the future, what they think about the planned U.S. withdrawal, or whether they want the U.S. To stay in Syria, to withdraw from Syria, their plans for the future, and also just to collect basic demographic information about who they are, the ethnic composition. And I've as far as I know, I'm the first person that's done a survey like this, so I'm pretty excited that it's now going to be published with the Wilson Center. It should be published next week. And as you may know, the Arab Barometer has actually done surveys of 15 different countries in the Middle East and North Africa since 2006. They've done multiple waves of surveys, but Syria was actually never included in any of their surveys. And so, in a region that is characterized by very closed and authoritarian regimes, Syria is perhaps one of the most closed and authoritarian in the sense that it's just has not been accessible to researchers. And so that's why I'm pretty excited that I was able to get access and to do this survey with the SDF. I made sure that I included all of the various ethnic groups, including Arabs, Kurds, Syriac, Assyrian, Chaldean Christians, Yazidis, and Turkmen. I included men and women. I included people from all of the 6 governorates. And because I think often, Syria is discussed in the context of the interests of the Assad regime or Turkey or the United States or Iran, but we actually don't hear a lot about the interests of the SDF. I mean, people talk about them, but they don't actually talk to them or listen to them. And so this was my attempt to allow their voices to be heard, because I think it's important in the post-caliphate era that we also listen to their concerns and their plans for the future of this region, which they now control.
Excellent, thank you so much. And I think Wilson Center will be doing some launching event for the report.
Well, it will be published next week. I'm actually going to be speaking at a congressional briefing in November, on November 6th, about Syria and the refugee issue in Turkey. And so that will be a briefing in Congress on November 6th. A report should be available next week at the Wilson Center on their website.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.